there. All right, very good. And I'm gonna go grab some water myself. I'll be right back. We're waiting for Gabriel. Any follow-up thoughts about the conversation we had last week about urban design and the position we find ourselves in these days? I really appreciate the contribution, Yante, you gave to the discussion, kind of representing African Americans, I'm afraid, but you know, we all, I think, are very concerned about these equity issues. Well, the first, to introduce us to transportation planning, there are a lot of elements of it that you've heard of before, mass transit of various sorts. The little video I have to begin with, I noticed that one of these is not good anymore, but I think the first one is still good. I'd like to show you to kind of make you aware of another form of transportation, which is kind of promising, I think. Transportation planning here. Let's see, Gabriel come back to us yet. Has anybody heard of these pods that you use to travel around in? The driverless cars?
Like the high-speed rail, but with
I'm talking about
cars?
driverless cars.
Oh, just driverless cars?
Well, there's an argument to be made within the suburban structure especially, that you know, we're pretty much forced into a somewhat dispersed, certainly more dispersed settlement than we have in cities, right? Even though we may be trying to make it more cohesive and more urban, it's got a different vibe to it. People are spread out more, and that makes it problematic from a train, you know, or particular kind of traditional mass transit kind of operation. And so there's some new ideas coming out. Now I have to say right up front that these ideas about, you know, driverless cars as part of a mass transit option was something that was introduced for the West Ashley planning process, and people locally just said, no. But, you know, I thought it was an interesting idea, and one that I'm not sure how we're going to avoid. I mean, it's going to be interesting. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and start the video. Hopefully Gabriel will catch up with us soon. Oops, wait a minute. Stop. I need to make sure I'm sharing the right screen. That's it. Okay. Now I'm ready to go. And do we have sound? No. We're in Singapore.
The main Piatti Road is accessible from all parts of the district and includes service roads within HDB car park area.
Well, I need to turn on the closed captioning. Sorry about that.
Piattis will connect high-density areas marked by the red dots in order to disperse human traffic quickly and efficiently. Our pods are hybrid between normal Piattis and electric vehicles. They are automated and able to run on normal roads guided by magnets installed beneath the road surface. The pods will be equipped with either 2 seats or 4 seats to cater for bigger group. Passengers then choose their destinations inside the pods. The pod stops are built from repurposed bus stops, where our pods will wait for passengers instead of vice versa. The main role of the GRTs or hot pods is to disperse traffic from high-density areas. They will make use of the same road system as the pods, which enable them to be fully automated and choose the most efficient route within the 2 high-density areas. There are 3 main features of our intelligent transport system: magnetic guideways, intelligent traffic control, and intervehicular communication system. All 3 of them will ensure seamless and safe mobility. The concept of floating car data will enable Traffic Control Center to receive traffic demand by detecting mobile signals and interpret them as real-time traffic info. The proposed lakeside village will serve as a link between the Jurong Gateway and the leisure precinct and bring the lake closer to the gateway. It will be a haven for play, shopping, and nature endeavors. There are plans for future collaboration with Toyota to provide Toyota winglets and aerials to aid mobility within the village. The proposed underpass is our pier de resistance and will make use of the waterway to connect the lakeside village to Jurong Gateway, Chinese Garden, and Japanese Garden. It will be constructed using the cost-effective immersed tube method and provide a unique traveling and shopping experience under the lake. There will be 2 main car parks provided at the entrance of Jurong Gateway District, situated next to the exits of VIE and AYE. The main purpose is to aid intermodal change between residents or visitors' personal cars into pods or hot pods. The parking system is automated and seamless, with residents having the extra privilege of free pods transport to and from their houses. VIM Private Limited seeks not only to modernize, but also to strike the right balance between progress and sustainability. Our vision of seamless, elegant, and green hails down the dawn of the next century's transport system, and we are confident in our ability to make it come true.
Where is this? Where is this being developed?
Well, this is a concept for Singapore.
Hmm.
Was that 2008?
Yeah, that's been a
Wow.
while.
Wow.
These ideas are, stop share. Okay, these ideas have been out there for a while, and was actually proposed for West Ashley as another way to try to incorporate transit in an area that was already dominated by roads anyway, and it was poo-pooed, maybe because people saw it as simply a rich person's, how shall I say, mode of transportation. But I think there might be something to it that could work in other areas. There's no reason why, except that it's new and going to be expensive to incorporate, that we couldn't try to develop some of these ideas. It's just as a thought out there. It's sort of a compromise between the car and a bus.
Have you seen, this is kind of just off subject slightly with the pods, but have you seen, like in Latin America, urban gondolas? and how that's used a lot in like Mexico and Brazil.
You'll have to give me a better definition of, I know what a gondola is, and I have a
S-
rough idea. I've been to both those places, but I'm trying to picture what you're saying. Sorry.
Well, I think it depends on the city. Like West Ashley wouldn't work because it's not the topography isn't right. You know, it's flat, but it's like a ski slope or but over all the whole city, so you can go from one area to the city to the other over it.
So a monorail on up of.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, and they were apparently looking at that for Boston, which is not a terribly inclined city.
They've got hills
So
in Boston. They've got hills.
yeah, I mean, I've never been to Boston. I've always, since it's on the sea, I always thought it's flat, but I guess not.
No,
Um,
it's pretty hilly.
yeah. Well, anyway, regardless, that just sounds like a really cool thing. But I don't think that would work in Charleston. But it would be just cool to go over all the traffic, and just to kind of be in the sky for that.
There was actually an interesting development when the Navy base was first given over back out of the Navy. One of the first institutions to go in there was developing a monorail system. And they built a model, I think, at half scale. Fritz Hollings was very much behind it at the time. Of course, Fritz is retired and gone, but that was consideration for using along the rail lines coming downtown. Right now, in fact, there's the old rail line, the best friend rail lines.
Is that on the east side?
Well, it's up.
Um,
It's not, east side is just off to the side of it. It goes right down to the heart of everything. You know where the visitor center is now, right?
yes.
That's sort of the end of the rail line. And the rail line would carry all the way back up through North Charleston and through Somerville and all the way.
Okay.
But in one of the complaints about the bus rapid transit proposals that are out there, I was just reading about this week, is that they're going to stop the bus station well north of the low line and of the crosstown and stuff, which means it's not going to be very well, shall we say, integrated or stitched into the transportation downtown. And so this would have been an opportunity to be able to get that in there because it would be going above traffic. So all of the traffic going through there won't have to stop for it. It'll be going above it. So it's kind of an interesting idea in that connection. So yeah, downtown, I think we could have something like that. It's going to be more expensive than building buses, having buses, but yeah, that's a possibility there for sure.
Is this the one that you were talking about in Charleston? That was a bus program that was supposed to have its own lane or something that goes above traffic?
No, it was developed as a monorail system, like you find when you go to Walt Disney World. Those of you who've been to Disney World, you come in, on a monorail. It's the same kind of thing.
Huh. It's really weird that they would stop short of Charleston because it seems like as a transportation planning issue, one of the big things that's limiting the Charleston area is the fact that there's not a lot except for highways that get really clogged that connects Charleston to the rest of the municipality to places like West Ashley and North Charleston. Because
absolutely correct.
I will say though,
uh,
sorry. I will say though, I mean, I think the bus system around Charleston gets a bad rap. I don't think it's as good as it could be, but I mean, I think CARTA does a decent job with what they have. You can get. I have a friend whose mother actually works on campus, and they live in Mount Pleasant. And she doesn't drive. She parks at the Walmart in Mount Pleasant and catches the bus to downtown, and she gets there quicker, and she doesn't have to spend gas and sit in traffic. She can just sit on the bus and read or whatever. So I think anyway, I wish there were more routes and there was more funding for CARTA, but
right.
Well, anyway.
The visitor center was supposed to be the hub of the bus transportation downtown, and that this new BRT wouldn't come to that hub, violates all kinds of planning ideas that we were working with over the years. So I just mentioned that. Right, so there is another transportation issue, and it's a little bit different from the usual one. Certainly they don't talk about it in the textbook, I wanted to present that just as something interesting and different right up front. So I'm going to go back to my screen share and we'll go through some of the stuff that they talk about in the textbook. Emma, I'm sorry, I'm not going to leave other people out of the conversation. What did you guys think? Holland, Yante, Emma? You see something like that working downtown or in Charleston, generally speaking?
I think it probably could. I'm just concerned. I feel like we're probably have a smaller city than they do. So,
Well, one thing that's sure, they're a newer city than we have, and so putting in these magnetic strips going down the highways, making them into smart streets, you know, it's going to be easier for them.
Yeah, I think that's like, I'm sorry, it'll probably cost us way more money.
Yeah. Well, I think that's what was concerned to people West Ashley is that, you know, it was going to take money away from other projects. So maybe it's too futuristic, or maybe, you know, when the private sector kicks in and Google cars become more common, you know, then maybe something different will happen. Who knows? All right, let's see. Now back to screen share. I need to be PowerPointing it. And like you guys can't see that yet, I don't think. Hello. Where's my control panel? Hello, folks. Control panel. There it is. Screen share. All right, back to it. No, I don't want to do that. There. Share. Okay, I'm sorry. They have the end button right next to the share button, and I pressed the wrong one. Sorry about that. All right, so that's the first video here on transportation planning, which is where we ended up last time. So obviously we're dealing in a very car-centric culture with a lot of issues that we're all aware of. We've become too dispersed to really be practical to think about it in mass transit in many ways, in a traditional way like they do in Europe. To some extent, Europe was, you know, lucky to have to rebuild so much after the war that they were able to incorporate new technologies a little bit easier. So this just is reflecting on the fact that we're too spread out. We need to find ways to centralize or get people in closer or come up with alternative ideas that work to try to get people out of their cars. Whole new challenge. We're not the same as Europe. So the idea that tends to drive cars is that they are self-financed, that they are paid for by the individual when he pays his road taxes, insurance, and the cost of the car. The question is, you know, is it? And I think you guys are pretty imaginative and knowledgeable, and you realize that there's a lot that gets paid for by way of taxes for roads and so forth, which the individual car owner is spreading out over other people who may not own cars. You know, for example, 526 and completing 526, which is going to cost, you know, what was it, $1 billion last we looked, or slightly under that. You know, that's money that'll have to be paid for not only by everybody, not just car owners, but also by the next generation of people. And hopefully we're moving away from cars. And so there's a couple of real equity issues when you consider that. Anybody disagree with that or have any issues they want to pick up with that? We're good? All right, well, I'm going to keep going. Oops. Hello? Oh. All right, here we are. So see that I need to do this. There. So, you know, we've got the metropolitan planning people who basically look at everything very scientifically, and, you know, they develop these statistical models for deciding on transportation planning. I have to say that, you know, this is what we have to teach, and this is what a lot of traditional transportation planners use in their, you know, assessments. But right now, with the ability to track individual transportation, regardless of whether we have those smart cars, we can tell where everybody is. And that's the basis of Google Earth telling us, you know, or, I'm sorry, the Google Maps telling us that, you know, we should go this way instead of that based on traffic, because they kind of are starting to get algorithms out there that tell where everybody is and can you know, do this virtually real time. So we're kind of headed in that direction in our own automobiles right now anyway. But just to go through this, there's the idea that, you know, how many times you take a car is based on your socioeconomic group. The average middle-class person, for example, gets in the car 7 times a day. That may be changing, but you know, they basically look at, okay, so how many trips are we going to be taking? And then we go looking at the highways and see how you're going to be dividing up your trips among various destinations, and then try to figure out what method you're going to be using. Of course, these days it's mostly the cars, but you know, when we look at modal splits, they can be bicycles, they can be walking, they can be other forms of transportation like buses or some rapid transit. And then we look at how these trips, the various trips we'll be taking, will be divided among the various routes. And believe it or not, that's all done mathematically. And then they decide on whether or not we need to build a new road or expand a road. If that sounds a little abstract, it's because it is. And I think one of the positive features of having real-time tracking is that it becomes much more refined. Because one of the byproducts of using this kind of approach is that we are been creating something that is alluded to here on the corner of the screen here is induced demand. We build these roads based on a statistical model, and then immediately they're flooded with new traffic because everybody wants to use the new road, or they build in new things associated with it. That's called induced demand. And usually the road becomes outdated almost before it's built. And so trying to come up with a better way of looking at this that isn't totally reliant on a car, because it just seems to be endemic with cars and this process that we end up with these kinds of problems. Couple of the issues here, there's a wonderful acronym here called OPM. I think we may have talked about that before. It's short for other people's money. What happens is that whenever the federal government is trying to allocate money for expressways or any of the other projects, it's very easy for us to spend that money because it doesn't belong to us. It's not something that we have to pay for. And so what happens with other people's money is that it's subject to, first of all, spending more of it, but also to perhaps a little graft and corruption sometimes because people are not paying enough attention to where that money is going on a local level. The whole idea of bus mass transit, bus rapid transit, of course, we're familiar with because that's what Charleston is proposing right now, the big bendy buses and so forth. There's another acronym in there, the UMTA, or called UMTA, Urban Mass Transit Authority. They're basically the organization in Washington which is supposed to be riding herd over all this. And UMTA, for example, helps to fund part of the visitor center as part of that node for bus traffic downtown. And then looking at a total systems approach is trying to incorporate all of these traditional models plus the new ways we have of looking traffic to try to come up with a better prognostication of where we need to be building roads. All of this predicated on the fact that roads are for cars. And that's something that, you know, I think we're in the process of trying to do something about. So trying to come up with a new paradigm. This is the paradigm that transportation planners use, and this is how it's kind of evolving over time. This is a rather quick way of talking about it, but I'm trying to get through this quickly. There is a related concept here called the force of gravitation, which up till now I thought we all knew what it meant, but what the traffic transportation people are talking about is that the appeal of areas is proportional to the size and inversely proportional to the square of the distance. Now, if that doesn't get your mind wrapped around a telephone pole, I don't know what does, but this is part of the mathematical exercises you find yourself working in transportation planning. Having worked with Post Buckley, Shoe and Jernigan out of Miami and involved in a lot of highway projects, believe me, it's a headache. And I much prefer the newer types of traffic or transportation planners who deal more explicitly with various modes more effectively and in trying to incorporate pedestrian planning more as part of their thinking. But you can see what a rabbit hole this can be when you start looking at the engineering behind roadway development. Anyway, one of the biggest methods used to evaluate the routing of highways is this cost-benefit analysis, which relate directly to construction costs as well as land costs, and then looking at time savings in terms of transportation time, and then the operating expenses for automobiles. This is frequently what they use to determine whether or not a road gets built. This is the same kind of criteria that the Corps is using to decide whether or not the wall, for example, is feasible, and the kind of analysis they're using deciding on the routing of the wall. Again, it can become too mathematical, and what the city needs to do is step up and make sure that we have more organistic goals in place to decide on the routing of it. One of the other features here is that there's an accounting of human health and human life here associated with it, so that when they're looking at these options, if one option is going to save, a certain number of lives, they basically figure out whether or not, as it says here, according to the DOT, if there's a greater than a 1 in 1,000 chance that you might be killed, then they factor a $1 million expense in their planning. But if you're, if you are not coming up to that sort of ratio, then they figure, it's not worth it. Now, that's deeply problematic. There's a whole exercise within planning of trying to calculate the value of human lives. Can you believe that, Deontay? I mean, seriously? And one of the key problems with that, believe it or not, relates to the debate over smoking. And at the time when the original sort of thinking was about, whether or not the government should put labels on cigarettes and so forth, and was that, at the time they were saying that the average human life was worth only $300,000 based on the amount of money that the average person would make through the rest of their life and how much their life was being cut short by smoking. And so using that figure, they decided that it really wasn't worthwhile spending the money, which was going to cost billions, to retool, to put the advertising or, the labels on cigarettes about, how terrible they were. Well, it didn't take long for people to kind of come up with the idea that, human life was being undervalued there, and we need to do something better. So there's actually a long tradition of calculating how much people are worth. I think the fellow who came up and talked about it was labeled Dr. Death, but actually he had a very, interesting and elaborate way of trying to calculate this, because the cost of human health and, of life, liberty, and happiness now gets all distilled down into numbers and dollars. And this is somewhat problematic as we start to try to rethink our transportation systems. Cost-benefit analysis. Yeah, it's a mixed bag. Now, in face of the automobile, we're trying to build mass transit. Just like we said that the settlement patterns in Charleston are too spread out. Really, mass transit, as we usually think of it, requires about 2,000 people per square mile in order to pay for itself. And we nowhere achieve that around here, especially in the suburban areas, right? So what the idea is in planning for the transit is also doing land use planning. It forces the issue. If you're going to do mass transit, you've got to plan the areas so that you can get the densities that are required in order to make it work. And so what typically happens is we develop around nodes of activity. We can call those villages much more acceptably, I think, and develop the transportation with the land use. There are many compromises associated with that, associated with transit-oriented development. And let me see if this one still works. It did last week. Let me just see. Okay, yeah. Yeah, okay, very good. Down at the very bottom it is. There's the discussion about, mass transit and the usual way people think about it here. And let me make sure I'm sharing the right screen. Yep, there it is. Share it. And here we have something we don't get a lot of around here, but people are trying.
Monday morning in Tokyo. It is 8 a.m. and the Shinkansen Super Express is leaving for Osaka, whisking passengers out into the countryside and making the 350-mile journey in just 2.5 hours. Every day, the scene is repeated for still more passengers across the globe. In France, from Paris to Bordeaux. In Spain, from Madrid to Barcelona. In Taiwan, from Taipei to Kaohsiung. Today, throughout the developed world, high-speed trains are a fact of everyday life for millions of people, and soon will be for millions more. Increasingly, countries are turning to high-speed trains to meet the growing transportation needs of the 21st century.
these other countries have looked at their futures and said, modern high-speed rail has got to be a part of it, and an essential part of it. Without it, we can't grow, we can't prosper, we can't build the kind of society, the kind of economy that we want.
Is it reliable? Is it high-tech? Yes. Are there beautiful trains to travel on? Absolutely.
Sleek, modern, and employing the latest state-of-the-art technology, the story of high-speed trains begins nonetheless more than 50 years ago. In 1964, the first Tokaido Shinkansen left Tokyo, moving at speeds of 130 miles per hour and shuttling 100 million passengers in its first 3 years in service. It was an unparalleled success and set off a transportation revolution worldwide. In 1981, the TGV began operations in France, drawing 1 billion passengers in 20 years and revolutionizing the way Europeans traveled. Today, 12 countries throughout the world have high-speed rail systems in place, with the reach of new high-speed lines ever expanding. 8 more countries, including Mexico, Russia, and Argentina, are currently building or planning their own high-speed systems, and will soon have them up and running.
No European country, certainly not Japan, or many countries in Asia these days would think of moving into the future without high-speed rail. I mean, they're all investing in it. Every European country, every part of the European community is investing heavily in what will be a first-class high-speed rail system that will connect the entire European community.
Today's high-speed trains are faster, quieter, and more energy efficient than ever. Today's 8th generation Shinkansen trains routinely operate at 185 miles per hour. The French TGV now operates at 200 miles per hour in regular revenue service. China has recently opened a new train line designed for speeds of up to 217 miles per hour. And high-speed train technology has not yet reached its limits. An operational German ICE train has reached 252 miles per hour. Test runs on Japan's Shinkansen have reached 277 miles per hour. And in 2007, an experimental French TGV train reached a world record rail speed of 357 miles per hour.
Thanks to the latest improvements, it's now possible to go from downtown London to downtown Paris in 2 hours and 15 minutes. And of course, it's getting enormous range.
For passengers, travel on high-speed trains offers unparalleled reliability, safety, and accessibility, rivaling point-to-point travel times for air travel on trips up to 500 miles, and easily outstripping travel times by automobile and conventional rail service. In the densest urban centers in the world, high-speed trains provide a complementary transportation technology that eases congestion on highways and frees capacity at increasingly crowded airports. By seamlessly integrating high-speed trains with airports and other modes of transit, such as subways, light rail, buses, and commuter rail, high-speed trains offer passengers a functional transportation alternative, while at the same time promoting sustainable development patterns within existing urban cores. Clean electrically powered high-speed train technology also pays critical environmental dividends. One traveler's trip on a French TGV high-speed train produces 4 to 5 times less carbon emissions than travel over the same distance by air.
Money spent today is going to go a long way in the future, and it's evidenced by the other countries that have high-speed rail. People are happier, they're getting to work on time, they're paying less for transportation costs, and they're helping the environment. California, I believe, has to look to high-speed rail as the #1 priority.
If you look at the other countries of the world that have high-speed rail systems, Japan, France, Germany, California is about the same scale, and we're approaching the same density of people. You know, France has 55, 60 million people. We're going to reach 50 million people by 2030, it's estimated.
California is perfectly fitted and set up in where the major centers of population are, where the distances are, where the people need to move.
San Francisco to Los Angeles, that's about 400 miles, 420 miles. Those are systems that lend themselves to high-speed rail.
Around the world, high-speed trains are a proven, safe, and environmentally sustainable technology for meeting the transportation needs of the 21st century. By offering a fast, frequent, and enjoyable travel alternative, high-speed trains fit in perfectly with a regional intercity transportation matrix that works. It can work in California, too.
So we've gone, let's see, stop share, back here. We've gone from this car to the pod. Notice that the guy doing the transcription of the voice called them pots instead of pods, but anyway, whatever. Two more regionally based strict systems that allow for higher speed transportation. And this, I think, is really exciting. Now, one of the things I have to say is California came really close to doing it, and then, the money hasn't been there, but they're still thinking about it. There's also discussions about doing it between New York and Washington, for example, in that area. That was the other area of the map that showed up. Those areas have the kind of densities and population and draw between areas that would make such a technological effort worthwhile. How many of you have ever traveled on a high-speed train before? Anybody?
I have in Jersey.
In Jersey, yeah. Was it a reasonable experience?
Yeah, it was pretty dope. I would prefer to travel on the rail. Like whenever I go up there, I like to get on the train just because.
Yeah, and the high-speed stuff, they're a lot better ride than the lower speed trains for sure.
Yeah, and they just feel safer. I'm not saying they are safer, but they just feel safer.
Yeah, I agree with you. Anybody else?
Yeah, I really like them too. They're really convenient.
Which one did you take?
I've been on ones in New York and then across Europe.
Right. Well, last summer I went on the Channel on a high-speed train, and that was quite an experience. Yeah, they're a great way to get around. There are a couple of problems with it, though, and I'll just mention quickly, and that is the time frame. Can you imagine the amount of money that it takes to pull this thing off? Only, would be justified in certain areas like, the California from San Francisco down to Los Angeles or places like that. And the other problem is that getting the property and figuring out where all the details of this thing, it's going to take you anywhere from 30 to 50 or 60 years, right? So one of the problems that the planning had in California was that when they started it and they started the process, by the time they came out with their recommendations, stuff in the field had changed so dramatically because of the sprawl, because of the property values, because people's interest and employment centers had changed a little bit, that it made it more difficult to find approval a generation or two later, if you see what I'm saying. So not only are you faced with the expense and the difficulties on the technical level and on the planning level, you also have a generational problem. What if one generation doesn't want the same thing as the next generation? So that makes it a little bit more complicated, that time frame, if that makes sense. So yeah, transportation planning. Back to that. So yeah, transit-oriented development is a big deal. If we're going to get the kind of densities, if we're going to get the kind of urbanity that we're talking about, it's going to require much more, shall we say, intense transportation network. I think most people have pretty much decided that's a good idea. Oops, why am I getting, oh, there we go, sorry. Yeah, what we're dealing with right now is something called paratransit, which is this bus rapid transit, sometimes referred to, especially in London, as the bendy bus, and it's supposed to be a compromise. And there are a lot of people, Columbia, I think, for example, developed the paratransit very successfully with more limited resources. And so I'm not trying to poo-poo it all together, but we're just looking at all the options. I think at the end of the day, we're looking at a combination of all of these things, quite frankly. So, how it works and how we knit it together and make it work for us is the big question. So here we have the paratransit. Also in the UK, they have the double-decker bus, which is a lot of fun too. And then the biggest problem that people talk about with transportation is that, you know, it's for poor people, right? You know, nobody, you know, who has the money to buy a car is going to want to ride a bus. Well, you know, that's partially because we haven't been investing in it, and consequently it doesn't have the sort of, you know, vibe that people like. But what's happening, I think, more and more is, especially with the advent of smartphones, is that we're able to predict and use this kind of transit much more effectively. And then with more lines being put in and buses coming more frequently together with the technology, it's easier to kind of make them appeal to people. And quite frankly, with bus stations, you know, having them tarted up and looking good and being part of a shopping area becomes part of a more middle class experience and perhaps more acceptable for a broader section of people. What was that? Sorry? I think we just stuff going on. So we have what we're working with today, which is kind of a hybrid system, trying to use management systems that include toll roads, high occupancy vehicle lanes, special lanes that are set aside that people pay extra for so they can drive faster with fewer cars on it, the hot lanes. Coming up with intelligent vehicles, then smart highways. One of the extremes of that was the first one I presented. And so we're looking at trying to develop, you know, shall we say, smaller scale solutions. But then there's this tiered network of high-speed rail and other forms of transportation, which also need to be part of our consideration. This, I think, above all, necessitates a regional, state, and multiple state approach to the problem of transportation. And it requires, I think, a little bit of federal direction in order to make that happen. And the feds don't seem to be terribly keen on getting involved. I'm not quite sure, you know, I think transportation may be our downfall before it's all over with, but I'm hoping that we can overcome the issues and make it work for us. So here we have from the sublime to the ridiculous maybe, but we're trying to work on multiple scales to try to deal with the way our reliance on cars has forced us into what amounts to a really problematic living circumstance. As Ellis was saying, he's tired of the sprawl, right? We need to find solutions that work. And also look to other places and see, you know, how we might be able to incorporate at least some of those ideas. It will, at the end of the day, be unique to this place, but these are places that, you know, we need to look at. Not going far, the last trip I was up in Toronto, I had a chance to kind of play around with their transportation systems. And although it's not the high-speed rail that we were talking about before, it's much more of an integrated and varied type of transportation system, because as you can see on their map, they've got commuter rail tied in with street level rail, tied into buses, tied into pedestrian systems and bicycles that seem to work a little bit better. It's just a lot of fun connecting these places together using the trams, as you see in the lower right hand corner, with the bicycles there, the rental bicycles, has created a lot more in terms of street life. And even as you can see in the upper right hand side, managing the car and the parking of the car more effectively, making it easier to park and then be able to get onto one of these transportation systems, has created a lot more fluidity and accessibility within cities, within Toronto. The other thing I like about Toronto is it's got so many little individual ethnic areas and villages along the way. And this is, I think, an exciting part of trying to connect places together, is that they can literally feed off each other. Notice the food. Sorry, I couldn't help it. And of course, the ability to eat on sidewalks and to be outside and to enjoy urban life is what it's all about. As you can see, we were having a good time that day. So, it occurs on multiple levels. I just wanted to throw, you know, a spectacular solution out there like they use in Toronto, because I think, you know, muddling through with our transportation system might very well be our future, but it needn't be one that is disappointing because we don't measure up to some of the the best transportation systems in the world because we have our own value here, our own sense of city and place is really what the important thing is here when we start talking about transportation. So quickly, what do you see as the difference between an edge city and a transit-oriented development? I'm going to pick on Emma. You can be flippant with this, by the way. I mean, these are two extremes, right?
Yeah. I mean, an edge city is more of like something that's not connected.
Except by car.
Except by car, right.
Exactly. So it's the exact opposite of transit-oriented development, which is starting with transportation and the settlement, right? So that's fairly straightforward, and we can illustrate that with specific examples. Very good. And then how have historical reflections of famous planners turned out? Remember, we had Frank Lloyd Wright, we had Arco Santi, we had the Radiant City and others. How have they really turned out? I'm going to ask, let's see, what did I pick on, Emma before Holland?
I definitely think like in some instances, there were progressions and innovations made, and then you also got to see like what worked and what didn't work.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Great. Because, I mean, you know, to some extent, if we're going to think about the future, we're going to be, how shall I say, making forecasts, which will not turn out. But that process gives us, you know, the matter to kind of deal with the everyday question. We have to look forward in order to set goals and make progress. But at the same time, we shouldn't be disappointed if it doesn't look exactly like what the goals or what our vision was initially, right? It doesn't make the process any worse. It's still worth noting these kinds of key thinkers. All right, Yante, how has urban renewal been good or bad for cities? That's not very well said. Has it been good or bad for cities in your view?
I believe that based on the notion of like material, like I don't know how to explain. I don't know how to put into words what's in my mind.
Well,
and yeah, I think it's been good to a certain extent, based on like as far as like equity and classism, not really. But as far as resources, like on a general, from a general's perspective, then yeah, possibly.
Well, I should have put renewal in capital letters here too, right? Because urban renewal was that Housing Act of, what was it, 1949? And really served to displace a lot of people as they looked to make rapid changes really quick. And urban renewal, to the extent that it tried to breathe life into cities, in the long term has been okay, but there's been a lot of people hurt in that process needlessly. And so as a result of the experience of urban renewal from that act in 1949, they rewrote it in, what was it, 73 or 74, and said, we're going to do urban renewal, but it's going to be on a more gradual level because it's too painful to people and too many people are displaced by the way we were doing it before, which is paying just for demolition. So yeah, urban renewal has been bad for cities in terms of housing and the displaced, good maybe long term, but the real takeaway from it has been a revision of the idea of we need to take a more gradualist approach to change, especially when it comes to housing. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Very good. No, I think you were on the right track, no pun intended, but I was just kind of trying to contextualize it with the text in our discussion. All right, let's see. Ellis, what do you think federal efforts have done to affect housing, and how does it differ from rich or middle class people and the poor?
Federal efforts have negatively affected housing, starting with the New Deal almost 80 years ago. It has led to increased segregation, You have instances where minorities, even if they had the necessary credit, would not gain access to certain neighborhoods. And that led to extreme segregation, which eventually led to poverty in central cities. So yeah, they haven't been good unless you're, like it says in the question, unless you're rich or middle class Caucasians.
Right. So you've got the idea of it certainly well in hand, but we need to be more specific in answering a response to it when talking about, for example, the Federal Highway Administration and the creation of expressways that tended to split pieces up, the federal, and then also the Federal Housing Act, which developed basically a middle class how shall I say template that got applied over everything, and that plus the highways tended to make for sprawl, and the poor got left behind is what it basically boiled down to. And there's also, so you can look at both FHAs, the Federal Housing Administration, the Federal Highway Administration is driving a federal effort that has affected housing. And then you can also look just on the face of it as you think about the amount of money that we spend to subsidize a middle class housing through tax abatement versus how much we spend directly for subsidized housing for the poor. It's like a factor of 5 difference or more. And so, yeah, just by the federal government has basically put their money where their mouth is, and their mouth has been, maybe not always telling the truth. I didn't say that very well, but I think you get the idea. Yeah, it's hard to.
I think.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
No.
I also would like to add that I think I agree with Ellis. Like, whenever we talk about this stuff, we have to also bring up like the fact that alongside this comes like gentrification. I think that urban renewal is gentrification, in my opinion, or at least it was. That's how it started. Whether it on paper when it was first, brought into the conversation,
right.
Whether it was supposed to be that way, it was that way when it was executed physically. So I think that's something that we should, that like I'm interested in knowing more about too, because I honestly, they're synonymous to me.
I hear you. And I think that's a reasonable point of view. And I'd like to come back to that because there's a couple of follow-up questions to that, which I'd like to ask, but it's going to take us out of our review just here real quick. And we'll come back to it if that'll be all right, okay? Yeah. And then it's back to you, Gabriel. 3 factors that led to the housing crash of 2006.
So the repeal of Siegel, the phone
Siegel, right?
What was it? The full name?
Glass-Steagall. It's a hyphenated 2 people.
Right. The repeal of Glass-Steagall, that Depression era law that prevented people from speculating on other people's money.
Not people, but bankers.
Bankers from speculating on with their own constituents' money, right? And then you would have the lack of regulation, the fact that people were basically, no one was keeping account of what all these packages were. They were throwing together these subprime mortgage packages, throwing triple or the highest quality ratings on them when really there was no substance to them at all. And a lot of the people working with them had no idea what they were, just that they made money, that they were a good investment. So they just kept passing it on. No one was really crunching the numbers and realizing that there was no substance to it, that they were lending really bad credit. And that the whole bubble was built on credit. You had developers pushing this. The whole economy was dependent on it. The fact that the economy was so dependent on that growth is definitely one of those factors. And then an interesting one that you mentioned the last time was the fact that this was happening in the early 2000s. People were just getting into computers, and there was an aspect of unpersonalization, depersonalization that was happening, where people, part of that unaccountability was happening, that because people were no longer doing the face-to-face interactions. A lot of it was happening online, and there wasn't a good culture established for how to be accountable in that environment yet.
The technology certainly got ahead of us, didn't it?
Hmm.
Yeah, and that's a very well stated, response that I think that most people can understand. The textbook talks about securitizing the investments and stuff, which just makes my eyes glaze over, but that's the way they talk about it. They made it so hard to see in this particular securitized package of loans what the real story is. Nobody could figure it out. There's some great movies about this, by the way.
The Big Short's a great one.
Which one?
The Big Short.
Yep, The Big Short's a great one. That's correct. And so this is all, part of the discussion that we've been having over the past couple of times. Very good. Well done. So I've been talking not quite an hour. We've got, let's see, okay. And so what I want to do is grab some more water and with some hesitancy, try to get through a couple of more of these chapters to get back on track, if that would be okay. Is everybody doing all right? Yante, are you still hanging there? You've got a 12-hour shift and you walked into this much talking?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay. Well, let's take just a minute, grab a, candy bar or a glass of water or something, and we'll come back here and we'll try to get through the rest of this. This is really good discussions tonight. You guys are really following along, I think, the meaning of it, and I appreciate that. Hopefully this will all, contribute to, your careers in a meaningful way. So let me stop this and everybody check in when they get back. I see Ellis. Everybody else is just a name or initial.
I'm back.
Alan, very good. So what do you guys think? Do you think we're going to be coming out of the quarantine soon successfully or not?
I'm not sure. Here in South Carolina, I know cases, it's like 300 something a day, which is so much more than it used to be. So I don't know.
Yeah. I think it's exacerbated the split between the rural people who are, by the very nature of it, not going to be in contact with quite so many people as the urban people. And, so all of a sudden there's this division between people who live out in the country and people who live in the cities who have to be more concerned about this.
Right.
And when the cities close down business, that affects everybody.
I know I teach at a dance studio and they're opening, I think it's Monday, but I have asthma, so I'm not going back, but I know a lot of parents are sending their kids there, so I guess we'll see how it goes.
Well, I sympathize with you. I had adult onset asthma myself for quite a while. It was very difficult. Is yours exacerbated by the humidity here or the pollen?
It's definitely the pollen, and it's also like exercise too. So.
You're allergic to exercise?
Well, so I have the regular asthma, and then I also have exercise induced, which is great because I do a lot of stuff on dance team, so that doesn't make it easier, but.
One of the things that asthma forced me to do, which ended up being a reasonable thing, is to take up swimming.
I have had trouble breathing for that. I feel like that would help.
I mean, not everybody likes to swim, but it's not a bad form of exercise. It's better on your joints than a lot of things.
Definitely.
And we have a fair number of pools, only one of which is open right now, but hopefully soon the rest of them will be.
I hope.
Mm-hmm. I love my almonds. Sorry about that. Well, people are coming back. I'm going to go check to see if my phone came today. One second. Nope, no phone. You ever dropped a phone and had it like bruise? My phone picture, I can only see the very top of it. The rest of it, I could hardly read at all. I dropped
Oh
it,
no.
and it was this little blemish on it, and then all of a sudden it got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. I ordered a replacement screen for it, but it hasn't come. I've been waiting for it for 2 weeks, and this has gotten nothing but worse. So went ahead and broke down and got on an easy payment system a little bit better phone. But one of the things I think I'm going to be doing is trying to use the phone if we have to do remote teaching for drafting, because I can cycle the phone camera into the browser and I can actually draft for people here and have them be able to see it, which is kind of an interesting idea. I've worked with a client I've got overseas doing it, and it's been pretty successful. It's a lot easier to, you know, do it that way than trying to describe a drawing, you know what I mean? So anyway, we're working on that. All kinds of changes, right? All right. Well, I can't ask who's not back yet, but Holland is here. Emma, are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Very good. Yante, are you back?
Yes.
Very good. Gabriel, you back? And he'll catch up with us. I see Ellis up there. Okay, cool. All right. There's other fields of planning, and not exactly my favorite, but still we need to talk about it because it's important. Economic development planning has become much more important in the last decade or so. We've seen the effects of it here in Charleston with the advent of Boeing, and in other places, the BMW plant up in the upcountry that now we use, we distribute here in Charleston. It's a major area within planning, but it's been one that has had mixed results. It tends to be very competitive because, you know, cities end up vying with each other for money, for the benefit of having a business there. The tax rates are directly affected by having the business there because the business can contribute more to the local tax base, and so consequently governments really like to have them come in, even though perhaps the tax base doesn't reflect the true cost of the business, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute. The earliest efforts at economic planning go way back. The Erie Canal was basically used to bring in goods to New York City. In fact, it was one of the contributing factors. And during the colonial period, you know, South Carolina, Charleston was on par, more or less, with New York. But over time, Charleston lost its market area. Railroads started crisscrossing through it. It didn't have the kind of breadth of waterways that were up in New York. New York built the Erie Canal in order to capture a much larger market area and to promote its growth as a trading center. And so the Erie Canal, early up front, showed the value of this kind of regional economic development planning. As we start talking about economic development planning too, we need to remember the term we learned before about structural unemployment, where we need to be thinking about manpower training in order to keep people viable within the economy as it changes. And then, of course, what we have is the promotion of a lot of businesses going into areas based on tax benefits. This is a classic case, I think, between the Democrats and the Republicans, perhaps. But, you know, on the one hand, the Democrats are all about trying to stimulate local economies by pumping money into having businesses go there. On the other hand, usually businesses, if it makes sense for them to go to that place, they will go there anyway. And so by being in a place that maybe for one reason or another is not quite so advantageous to what their business model is all about, but they're doing it just to collect taxes, the increased costs associated with their business get passed along to the public. That seems a little bit abstract, The textbook actually says it better than I am, but I think that you'll see that there's this idea, not that Adam Smith is completely right about everything, but there's this idea that somehow federal government's imposing itself and trying to, make micro changes to what is really a macro effort. And we've talked about just how the federal government's involvement in housing has been a little bit mixed. It's certainly true when we start talking about economic development plan. So, as it says, the real question here when we look at this is whether or not the intervention changes the market conditions artificially and ends up raising prices for consumers. Of course, there are winners and losers when we start talking about this. On the one hand, we have the local areas which may benefit greatly, but everybody else doesn't. And so the politics is a big part of this. So on the federal level, we have got kind of an interesting mixed bag coming along, but the feds have been also interested in doing some economic development planning. And now, we have more being done on a local level. On a state level, as the money's been declining, the states have tried to come in and pick up the slack. I think you all have heard about our former governor who went to the Paris air show, very controversial thing to do, but it was because now we have Boeing in South Carolina, now states have individual offices and overseas in other countries because the states are picking up the slack from the feds. And so this is part of the phenomenon we're faced with. We're looking at several states have been instrumental in bringing in particular businesses. In Alabama, the Mercedes-Benz went there, in Spartanburg, BMW, and of course Boeing here in North Charleston. Getting back to the point I was making earlier about, whether the state is really the best agency for this, there's a question about it, mostly as it relates, I think, to how much money is actually given, how much public money is actually given, and how many jobs are actually generated. We look at Mercedes-Benz, they put about $250 million worth of tax breaks out there, which worked out by the end of the day to about $168,000 of tax breaks per job. That seems like an awful lot, doesn't it? But, there's a big question here. BMW in Spartanburg ended up about $65,000 per job of public inducements to get them to move there, making the land available to them, providing road infrastructure, providing other kinds of support, land use control, easing, infrastructure, water lines, sewer lines, roads, all that kind of stuff. How much does it cost, and then how many jobs are really generated from it? The Boeing in North Charleston, the best guess is that we invested about $900 million. That's like, we're talking almost $1 billion there just for Boeing. And if we look at the amount of money per job, I don't know that anybody's really calculated it just yet, but it's far more than what we're looking at here. There's a big question there, Boeing's done a lot of good, but they've also cost us a lot of money. And so there's a question about, equity, if nothing else, about how many people are really benefiting from this while the rest of the public is paying for it. So what this has also done is promoted a lot of state interests in trying to keep their taxes down, but in the process, what they're doing is cutting out workers' rights, if nothing else. Specifically, South Carolina was chosen, for example, for Boeing, and you'll notice these other places are all in the South, which are primarily right-to-work states, which is a misnomer if ever there was one. Basically, it means that they don't allow unions to have much sway in the local labor market. And so this becomes a way for these organizations to cut their costs. And that doesn't even get factored into this amount of money in public infrastructure per job. And so there was a big deal, a big controversy whenever Boeing came to South Carolina, because the labor union said they were doing it basically as an act of, how shall I say, putting the labor unions down. And actually there's a federal law that says they can't do that, but it didn't get didn't get enforced in this case. So the idea is that we bring in a lot of public money, we're able to cut taxes, but end up raising costs, and in the process also reducing services to make up the difference as these places get these large organizations. Of course, there's a lot of street cred that go with, getting Bowen. I think Governor Haley, has been an interesting example. She rode the success she had to federal office. And in her political career, people see it as a total positive, when in fact it's a little bit more mixed. So there are, very different perspectives on this problem, from a political perspective versus an equity perspective, from taxes and so forth. The idea of doing state planning is one that's definitely problematic in that respect. However, having said all that, realizing that people are paying attention, what tends to happen these days is that we work more now on a local level, where the state, theoretically, is doing a better job of getting local municipalities to cooperate and not be at each other's throats. This is very helpful in order to create a more equitable situation. It's not perfect, but it's one step in the way. A good example of that would be Boeing. And looking at the examples of state mandated development in the area, we can see a lot of contrast, for example, between the early efforts to try to get the Hunley put in various places around it here. And the way the state managed that was to have various cities come up with alternative proposals to put that there, to create a special place there. In fact, it was the town of Mount Pleasant, the town of North Charleston, and the city of Charleston all together put in 3 different bids and were basically desperate for it, and ended up making us all competitors with each other. North Charleston ended up getting the bid, and it was, not the most pleasant of circumstances. Whereas with Boeing, all 3 municipalities had to come together and decide that, it was worth the effort to put it there, and all of the 3 areas got some benefit from it, even if we can argue about the dollars and cents of it. So what's happening is that economic development planning per force has gone from a federal level to a state level, now with the state overseeing local efforts, trying at more cooperation to try to get a better result. Of course, always, when you start talking about new jobs, and this relates to the money spent per job before, we build these things to create more jobs in areas, but many times these jobs, because of the structural unemployment of those areas, people can't do the jobs there. How many people in Charleston had built an airplane before Boeing came here? Not all that many. And so a lot of people came from elsewhere to get these jobs. It might also say that there was an attempt made to do some training for people here. In fact, the College of Charleston, North Charleston campus was built in order to try to, develop this kind of research associated with Boeing that would help to build the local economy. Well, that hasn't panned out so well. Maybe it will in the future, but at this point, the campus in North Charleston is virtually non-existent. But it was an effort. So the question of structural unemployment and ways to try to deal with that is very much still out there for consideration here. It's generally supported by property tax advocates who are just looking at the bottom line, and by business interests who are basically looking to get their taxes deferred over to other areas and spread the taxes that usually go to them out to a broader population. Bad for residents, good for businesses. The two are working at kind of cross purposes there. There are other case studies, like I say, when we were talking about the campus in North Charleston at the college, where we try to develop research parks, usually associated with universities, to try to do something about the structural unemployment and making employment more available to local people there. And that's been the effort so far, more or less successful. I don't know, it depends on the circumstance. The Atlanta Regional Commission, we were just bad-mouthing Atlanta earlier, Ellis, but the Atlanta Regional Commission's done a lot better job within the health industries to try to promote research and to bring all of the various health providers together to create a much more cooperative atmosphere there. So given the proper sort of state and regional organization and enough experience with it, it does take a while. It's possible to create something at this sort of master planned economic level, but it's a field that's problematic because of its history. I suppose we're figuring it out as we go, if that makes sense. It's something that's sometimes hard to teach because there have been a lot of people hurt by, you know, the changes that have been brought. So how do local communities do it? How do they get, you know, businesses to come in there? They basically try to sell the place. You know, quality of life is a big deal there. So consequently, the city of Charleston with Spoleto, North Charleston with its pro-business attitude, Mount Pleasant with its kind of laid-back residential feeling and its thriving kind of sprawling but thriving kind of enterprise, all together promoted this place for an organization like Boeing. Also, we subsidize it, usually reducing property taxes associated with it. This is where we get down to the cost per job and how much of it is legitimate. We also arrange special financing districts. This is a term which is worth knowing. TIF, T-I-F, that's another three-letter acronym for Tax Increment Finance District, which essentially means that they develop this concept where if a business comes into an area and they come into it usually in a depressed area, that they'll establish a baseline for taxes before the business started work. And then as the business develops and as the other land uses around it become more valuable, all the increases in taxes then get applied to public infrastructure, but in that area. So for example, they did a tax increment finance district around the visitor center when it was built. And so whenever they built the hotel, Charleston Renaissance, I forget the name of the hotel now, but several of the businesses around there, all the increase in property values, all that money got applied into sidewalk paving and trees and improvements just for that area. So it helps to build the business. And the same thing can get applied in some of these other planning projects as well. But another way that the community does it is with TIFs. Now, this is also just interestingly enough, Yante, if you get involved, I don't know, I guess if somebody gets involved in the East Side, that's become more controversial. The use of TIFs on the East Side has been somewhat problematic because it's kind of been used as a leverage for displacement. And so there is a political side to almost all of this for sure. And of course, making sites available is something else that local communities do. I was involved in the master plan for the area around the airport back in the 1980s. And that laid the groundwork and made sites available for Boeing when it came in the 2000s. So what we have here is perhaps long-term planning on a local level to try to make these places available. Mind you, that property that I designed stood vacant for quite a while, and they usually do before they actually get used. So this is something that sometimes is a difficult PR thing. And also to build buildings as incubators. We see that downtown in the cigar factory where we build buildings in order to encourage different kinds of businesses to come there. Usually incubator buildings are done for smaller businesses to try to encourage that. And then create funds available through what they're called revolving loans. Essentially, well, they'll loan money out for one business, and then they'll take the proceeds from that loan and use it to reinvest back into the community in order to create more growth, generally speaking. All of these are techniques that municipalities have to try to promote business in that local area, and is one way that communities have become central to economic development as it's starting to be practiced. It comes from a rather modeled history, though, and occasionally we lose track of it. And of course, looking at infrastructure, we talked about that already, and land use controls to enable it. So the trend today is towards smaller regional cooperation rather than state-mandated kind of auctions between various municipalities trying to come up with the most breaks to encourage a business there. It's a much better situation as it's developing, but it's certainly come from a kind of a modeled past. Right, so growth management. economic development planning. I think one of the key, before I get into this, one of the key features is realizing that there's a difference between doing economic development planning, which tends to be more long-term and offer more opportunity for, you know, cooperation and these kinds of network connections to build, than simple business planning or economic planning. Looking at economic development is going to be on a longer range basis, and one that involves, shall we say, more of the area, and there tends to be more winners whenever that happens. Not sure that we've completely solved the problem. Economic development planning, in my view, is a little bit dirty sometimes, and it's not my favorite field to get involved in, but it's part of the future, the present that we have now with Boeing here and others. So this is the reality that we're in, where we do this kind of thing. And there's always social equity issues involved in it, structural unemployment issues and the rest of it that have to be addressed one way or the other, more or less successfully in our case. All right, moving, that was kind of a mouthful, I'm sorry. But economic development planning is one that leaves me up at night worrying about whether or not we're doing the right thing, because you're always balancing out present costs against future possibilities. Anybody want to weigh in on this? Do you think Boeing's been good for the local community? I just ask you that. Anybody benefiting? We actually have a couple of preservation majors with jobs up at Boeing doing land analysis and finding out, you know, property acquisition for them and stuff like that, interestingly enough. They seem to be quite happy with it. What do you think? Ellis, you're the equity guy. What do you think? How far should states or local governments go to encourage new businesses in here, sometimes at the expense of the people who already live here?
I think, well, I don't really know about Boeing too much because I'm not from, but I'm from Spartanburg, so I do know a little bit about how BMW has affected the area. During the 1800s, 1900s up here, the textile industry was huge, and that's where a lot of people were working. But then starting in the 70s into the 90s, a lot of the mills closed down. And then I think in the mid 90s, late 90s, BMW came. And I'm sure a lot of people, I mean, the area has been growing, Spartanburg, Greenville. The area has been growing a lot. So a lot of people from up north or out west are moving here because of those jobs. But I think a lot of people who are from here, who lived here for generations, have worked at BMW. So I think for the area, it's been really good overall.
So it's not just BMW, it's the Michelin plant, it's the other area, the spin-off businesses, right?
Right, transportation, logistics. But I think it's been overall good. But I do think there's a problem with, they, like you were saying, these businesses come in like Boeing to an area in Charleston where probably not a lot of people have the necessary capital to work there. They don't have the education, and then they're going to have a lot of people who come from other areas to work there, and then that's going to raise cost of living, and it's going to displace people. So yeah, it's a catch-22. I don't know. I think it depends on how the business gets involved with the community, I guess.
And to this extent, we can't always justify it in terms of dollars and cents. Part of it has to do with the culture of the place, the politics of the place, and that's not a science, that's an art.
Yeah, and with Spartanburg, I think, with BMW coming, I think Spartanburg has been a manufacturing center for a long time. So BMW coming in, that's part of the manufacturing industry, so that helps. So even if it's a different kind of type of subset of the industry, as long as you're part of that overall industry, you can probably get pull from the pool But if say like, you know, if a manufacturing company comes to a city where there's no history of manufacturing, then why do that? Why would that be good for the community?
Yeah. Well, in the case of Charleston and North Charleston, there was a history with the naval base of people who were involved in that sort of thing, although not directly making airplanes, as you say. So yeah, I think I think you're reflecting on some really worthwhile points about, you know, needing to work with the culture of a place and trying to find something that's a fit, and helps to build the spirit of the place. And like I say, that's something that's hard to quantify per se, right?
Definitely. And by the way, it's funny that you say economic development is your least favorite part, or I don't know, I might be putting words into your mouth, but because that's the area that I'm most interested in, and I agree with you that it's been, you know, not great. It hasn't really worked well for everyday people, but it interests me the most how to use that part of urban planning to actually better most people's lives instead of, you know, help industry, and that's all that matters.
Well, having said that it's my least favorite part, I also admitted that I've been involved in a couple of them.
And that might be why it's your least favorite part.
Well, then I think about places like Denmark and Voorhees, the technical school there, and just you know, how much, I don't know, they were taken advantage of, I guess. Just they haven't had the political resources and clout to try to follow up and make sure that the right things happen. And this may be something that just takes time. I don't know, but it doesn't always make me feel like I'm doing good. Although I think it's part of our future, and we all have to find a way to work with it.
Definitely.
I think that one thing that we're probably going to be able to see as a litmus test for Boeing and whether bringing them here was a good idea and whether they are a good active member of this community is whether we're going to see any response out of them in regard to fortifying Charleston for the issue of sea level rise and the storm wall. When we think about who we have to rely on, when it comes to raising these funds, we think of the tax base and we think of the federal government, but Boeing is our big industry, one of our big industries, and then there's the tourism industry. It would be great to see some investment out of them in this local area that they've chosen to set up shop in. And if they don't, maybe that's proof that they are just a big corporation that has a soulless stake in this area just for labor and cheap taxes and land.
Yeah, that pretty well says it. So are we working towards a new future of sort of private sector and government cooperation, or are we going to become another Detroit?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good example.
Yeah. Very good. Good discussion. Anybody else? Holland, Yante, Emma, you want to pipe in?
I mean, I think we're in a situation where I think it's really important that we start talking about, you know, what's best for the everyday person instead of these corporations. And I think partly what's going on right now with, you know, Black Lives Matter, I think partly our system has to be completely changed, and the economic part of that would help people too.
Right, and as I was reflecting on with the example of Denmark, right now, economic development planning tends to benefit those people who already have, not people who don't.
Right, and it's just terrible, I think.
Yeah, and how do we work that? I mean, you know, that's one of the goals of being an urban planner is how do you figure on redistributing wealth and not just simply contributing to the rising difference between classes and economic spheres and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
I believe that I believe that one part of that is just, I'm sorry, it's really loud in my background. But
it's bad here. I can hear you fine.
Okay. I believe part of that is just simply like speaking up in areas where your voice matters, as far as like in the rooms with the big corporations and in the meetings with, you know, the elite speaking up so they can, you know, see that it's being raised and awareness is being raised on this topic. You know, I feel like a lot of like people who have the power to change or who can influence those who are the ones that are going to sign off and write off on the changes don't really speak up, or and you know, when it comes time, when push comes to shove, it's put on the back burner because they're, you know, they feel like the heat and the pressure is on them. So I just feel like, so yeah, that's all. Just speaking up and staying true to the truth.
Yeah. Well, and you know, one of the other things that it's a little bit problematic to talk about it, but we have to try to be balanced. Certainly we need to have a voice, people need to have a voice at the table. But I think it's also incumbent on people to be well informed and to come there, how shall I say, without half-baked ideas, but actually try to sit down and work it through. So, I mean, I think that, you know, the whole idea of government doing something for you is just wrong-headed to begin with. We need to be doing things for ourselves. And so having you taking this class, having others become more aware of, you know, just how things work, you become better informed. And as a consequence, you're better able to have a voice that people will listen to at that table. Now that's assuming that we can get away with discrimination, we can do away with discrimination and stuff, but essentially it's a two-way street. It always has been. People have got to come to the table with some legitimate thoughts and not just half-baked ideas. So yeah, we really, you know, need to help each other out in that respect, I think. Am I being too difficult here, Yante?
I'm sorry.
You're breaking. Sorry. Well,
I'm sorry. My thing was like going in and it was doing something stupid. I'm sorry. I honestly couldn't even hear what you said just now. Like the last 10 seconds, it was just breaking up.
Sorry about that. So how much of it is incumbent on the individual person to come there with a reasonable proposal, and how much of it is that government should simply open up the doors and do whatever anybody wants?
I'm sorry, can you say it one more time? Sorry.
So how much is it incumbent on local communities to come into these meetings, or say racial minorities to come into these meetings and have rational, reasoned proposals to put on the table, and how much of it should be that government should back out of the way and just let them have what they want? Or is there a compromise in there?
I believe that the government definitely shouldn't back all the way out the way, because then it would just be like chaos. It would be too many chiefs in the kitchen, or whatever that proverb is. Right. But I definitely believe that there should be some type of compromise where, you know, because there are public meetings where, you know, people can come and let their voice be heard, but the fruition of things that come to pass, it's obvious that the voices that speak up are obviously unheard. They're heard but unheard, you know. So I feel like it should definitely, it goes back to just the government and, you know, the elite, the upper class taking our voices serious, you know.
Exactly.
Especially minorities. And that's just the problem overall. Like Emma said, with the Black Lives Matter, everything, like overall with minorities, our voices are heard but unheard in so many, like in every area, every area of our life. Even the rich, you know, our voices are still unheard. So it's just really something that has to come about with just simply them wanting to make the change. You know, we're saying and doing all we can. It's now up to them to want to make the change. We can't force the government to, you know, want to hear our voice or want to take what we think will be best for our communities into action, unfortunately.
Well, we've got to find a way to make it work. I mean, just to reflect for a moment, I don't want to beat a dead horse. I've been talking for too long, but in the West Ashley planning process, they went out of their way while the consultant was working with them to make sure everybody was in. The newest technology was used, and we had, you know, snap polls of what we liked and what we didn't like. And they reached out to the African American community, especially in Maryville, and, you know, did a lot of due diligence there. Now, the West Ashley Revitalization Commission work, as it's called, is undertaking, economic development planning for that area. But I have been really discouraged recently, and I'm going to speak, how shall I say, as an individual here, not trying to say the college. I'm not trying to represent the college per se, but in the meetings, they now have it orchestrated so that only the council speaks to each other about the proposals, and at the end of the meeting, they allow people to stand up for a minute or two and speak what it is they have to say. And this checks off the box of public participation. But I am terribly discouraged by that, because I've seen instances where, in one case, an older African-American couple came in there to talk about or to find out about a specific proposal. But I mean, after 2 hours of meetings, they were, not able to stay any longer to actually sit through and be in the public discussion section in order to get their voices heard. And as they were walking out of the meeting room, I was like pulling my hair out saying, why doesn't one of the city officials go and get the information from them and find out what they want, and not just be so damn officious about their process? You see what I'm saying? It's a classic case of how we start off with good intentions, but then, we get tied up in the same old way of doing things. And it really bothered me at the time. So it's a hard thing. It's a difficult thing. And we all need to kind of be aware of the inequities and be willing to cross over a little bit farther. It's not all 50-50, is it? Sometimes you have to give a little bit more in order to help people. And that's building community, for that matter. So anyway, that's my reflection on your comments. So I hope that helps, or maybe I'm just talking to myself. I don't know.
No, yeah, I see your point.
Yeah. So we need to find a way to have a voice at the table, to have something to say while we're there, and not let them put you down. Is that fair? Very good. All right, here we go. Real quick, growth management, smart growth, sustainable development. These are all big terms that get thrown out there, and all of them have impacts on all this stuff. Oops, what am I doing? Growth management is considered, quote unquote, the regulation of amount, timing, location, and character of development. I haven't put you to sleep by now. There it is. Growth management usually is related to environmental concerns. A lot of times environmental concerns relates directly to quality of life and that sort of thing. And also indirectly, there are a lot of environmentalists who have a track record of being not necessarily the best for social equity issues. But that's another story. I don't want to push that too far, because environmental movement is trying to make an effort there. Uses the traditional practice of closely coordinated land use controls and capital investment with stated bias towards environmental concerns. What's not to like? After all, environment is altogether important. A couple of issues that come up, though. The problem is that typically, by taking just an environmental approach, you sometimes end up with very exclusionary kinds of development. I don't have to look much further than Kiowa Island to see that. It was based on the best of environmental approaches at the time, and the result is a white enclave out on one of the islands. Frequently, this happens in suburban areas outside of cities, and with areas that are richer, so people can afford the luxury of worrying about the herons and the animals. Not to say that people shouldn't. I'm just saying that it's a question of perhaps priorities. So in the process, we end up displacing people and trying to create these perfect environments, and then displacing people, and trying to find a way around that is sometimes problematic. I think that in our own case here in the Lowcountry, we have the opportunity to work specifically with the culture, the Gullah Geechee culture, the native, if I can use that term, native cultures here, because they have always been very much attuned to the environment. And to some extent, the Coastal Conservation League and their efforts to try to promote a local agriculture and the African American communities here have been playing into that. This is one advantage I think that we have over other places, in that we have a culture of respect for the land, and that the environmental groups and the social equity groups have a much more common stand here, so we may have an advantage here. Usually whenever you're dealing with environmental concerns, you also have environmental racism creeping in so that there are winners and losers in this discussion.
No.
I'm almost finished. And then we have NIMBY. Everybody knows what NIMBY is, right? Not in my backyard. Have you heard the new term YIMBY? Yes, in my backyard? It's kind of an interesting idea. So yeah, environmental concerns get expressed through growth management schemes, and you know they compare to these other two concepts, smart growth and sustainable development, as I'm going through it here. State level growth management has been keen on trying to keep growth management in place. State level growth management planning has been key in several key places like Hawaii. You can see when they put those laws in effect in Hawaii, the development just stopped. It was raising all the landscape at the time. Florida has a pretty good sense of state level growth management, although its attempt to enforce it has been problematic as it's gone from one Democratic to one Republican to one Democratic administration over the years. There's that funny term concurrency, which I've talked about before. Does anybody remember what that means, concurrency? It means having the infrastructure in place before the development goes in place. That was a key concern in Florida. And Oregon was trying to set up urban growth boundaries, trying to have a place beyond which they're not allowed to develop. All of these things have had some influence on the other states, but these have been the pioneering states that have been involved in it. New Jersey has been trying to get involved in this with its land use controls and developing various property tax sharing methods in order to keep the farmers in place. This is all explained in greater detail in the text. But again, on the state level control, this growth management has been primarily looking at environmental concerns. Another key buzzword that's out there is the smart growth idea, which is all about trying to control sprawl. Just for the record, and we've talked about this a couple of times, but here it's itemized. Sprawl is characterized by scattered development, commercial strip development, low density or single use development, kind of like slums, right? You know, all residential, poor accessibility with dysfunctional open spaces. This is a good term, good way to define sprawl, Ellis, especially as you're looking at, you know, that on your paper, right? So this is a good way to kind of characterize it. More successful in preserving open space than encouraging development in existing communities. So smart growth, just like environmental growth, has tended to be a tool for the, how shall I say, the already well-to-do, people who have the luxury to look at the environment. So this is another buzzword that's out there, but you know, one that we need to look at and hopefully we'll be working through. The idea that's in front of us all right now, which is trying to subsume all these ideas into one master concept, is the idea of sustainability. We certainly have been emphasizing that a great deal at the college campus. It was defined in 1987 as development that meets the need of the present without compromising future generations. It's kind of an overall idea, but it includes environmental, social, and economic, which you can quite as readily see, and it's very difficult, if not impossible, to accomplish. And what we have here is, as we develop this notion of social equity and so forth, we're promoting something which seems appropriate to talk about now, called the revolution of rising expectations. Of course, it depends on what perspective you bring into it as to whether it's a revolution or putting things right. But this has been a direct result of the sustainability movement. If you recall back, what was it, during Obama's administration, whenever there was Obama went to Turkey and said, you know, we really need to emphasize, you know, social equity issues here, and we need to do something about the repressive regimes that are here. It led to the Arab Spring. And that was a difficult time for everybody. In fact, if you look back on it now, I guess it's, what was it, only in Tunisia where the Arab Spring ended up being a net positive. It just resulted in more repressive regimes being put in place, if not actually the Syrian revolution, which is still working its way out. So the idea of the revolution of rising expectations is part of sustainability, even though I would find it difficult to find fault in any of the sentiments behind the notion of sustainability. putting it in place has been extraordinarily difficult. So it's a useful concept, and we need to kind of carry it forward. I'm not going to spend too much time on per capita loading right now. I think I talked about that once before. But the notion of the revolution of rising expectations is one that I think really dovetails into our current state of things. It's got to be seen as a long-term, long-haul prospect. If we put the kinds of goals and ideas in place right away, it does tend to lead towards social dislocation. So finding a way to get this put in place as a long-term planning option without compromising the stability of the local governance has always been tricky when we start talking about sustainability issues. And Black Lives Matter is part of this discussion today. It's just trying to see it in the context of other areas that have had to deal with, you know, the same revolution of rising expectations. This is the normal diagram you see for sustainability. I would say this is wrong. It's not the three legs of a stool. It's really one encompassed in another. The environment encompasses everything. The social is the next, and the economic is clustered somewhere at the bottom of it. We tend to give too much emphasis on economic, as a direct result of which we have this idea that we're being sustainable if we use green light bulbs. And that's not the case. It's a far more comprehensive approach that involves all of it. So like I say, I think we need to rethink this paradigm just a little bit to talk about it in terms of priorities and not losing sight of the fact that we come from a history where the environment has been the, shall we say, the concern for the environment has been the result of white privilege and privilege of the upper classes. All right, Ellis, this is your book. I think you and Gabriel, The Retrofitting Suburbia. And here you see, once you get into it, that they're looking at sprawl and trying to find ways to humanize it. There are some great examples here, for example, of retrofitting and infilling commercial areas and residential areas to make it more urban over time, taking a big parking lot and splitting it up into blocks. And she's got plenty of examples of that you might be able to use. I am done, thank goodness, right? Stop share. Anyway, sorry, I went on a bit long, but all good. I'm gonna stop recording now real quick.